Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. You're probably wondering why I'm not rapping. Well, believe it or not, those little rap vlogs, little rap things in the shed take about an hour and a half to do, even though it's just about a minute of rap, which is crazy. I thought it would be so much quicker. Anyway, I am deep in studies, but I still want to be able to produce some content with a quick turnaround. So I thought I would just do some reading occasionally and see what you guys think of it. The context for this one is Francis Drake, the seaman. Is that a funny word? The great seaman. He has a statue. He was born in the town where my family moved, Tavistock, and he has a statue there. And recently, it was decided to put a plaque on the statue to explain that, he was a nuanced character. He was involved with the slave trade. I think that's not a terrible solution. Instead of tearing statues down, it's fairly good to try to contextualize someone's life, I guess, instead of just tearing the statue down. So it's not the worst move I've ever heard of. However, there's another part of the plaque that says, he was he committed sort of crimes against the Spanish and raided their towns and things like that. Well, that part I'm not so keen on because in the historical context, not only was slavery universal at the time, terrible crime, of course, but universal. But regarding the Spanish, they were a tyrannous force, and it was a contest. It was a contest of civilization. Who's going to win? Francis Drake, through his activities, played a significant role in how history wound out, and as much as we're buddies across Europe now with the Spanish and everything like that, it wasn't so at the time, and it was a severe contest, which, and I'm an Englishman, so obviously I'm biased, but it had to be won. Anyway, I just thought we would read a little bit of history from before the time of when everything was trying to be sanitized, and just read a little bit about Francis Drake. See what you guys think. It's going to be boring, maybe, but just put it on in the background, bit of a podcasty type vibe. And so what we're reading from is a series for children, The Golden Pathway, and this is the book, Section 7, Behind the Scenes of History, and the chapter on Francis Drake, The World Encompassed. Let's have a bit of a read. Compared with the Spanish Empire, England was a very second-rate power. But she had her daring sailors and her merchant adventurers fully prepared to take all the risks of trade with newly discovered countries. These men did not see why they should be kept away from the markets of the New World, and if the Spaniards were prepared to use force to keep them away, they were prepared to use still greater force to break their way in. Thus it was that British ships began to sail to the Spanish Main as privateers instead of as peaceful traders. Thus it was that relations between Spain and England became more and more strained as the years went by, although political considerations kept both Philip and Elizabeth, that's the rulers of the time, from any open declaration of war, even when the Armada was being hounded up the Channel, so the famous Spanish Armada. Drake, this is Francis Drake, however, made his own private declaration of war on the Spaniards at an early age. He was born in 1541 near Tavistock, but when he was about 8 years old, he left Devon and went to live in one of the naval hulks anchored in the Medway. His father was a poor preacher, and Francis had to find a job as soon as he was old enough. He took naturally to the sea and was apprenticed to the master of a small ship in the coastal and cross-channel trade. He learned his seamanship so quickly and worked so well that when his master died, he left the little ship to Drake in his will. Drake was now a young man, sturdy and thick-set, short-tempered and heavy-handed, but generous and much less cruel than the average man of his times. He was quick to make up his mind, and in any emergency he could always be relied on for swift and daring but not foolhardy action. The Channel seas were all too narrow for him, and about 1564 he made his first voyage across the Atlantic as second in command to a Captain Lovell. Of this voyage we know nothing, except that something happened on it which made Drake the sworn foe of Spain all his life. His next voyage served only to increase his enmity. He sailed with Hawkins, who was engaged in the slave trade, then considered quite respectable. They were sheltering from a great storm in the harbor of San Juan d'Ulua in Mexico, when a powerful Spanish squadron came along, seeking refuge in the same anchorage. Hawkins could have held the entrance against the Spaniards with ease, but he allowed them to come in on the understanding that the two squadrons should anchor peacefully together. On the third day, the Spaniards suddenly attacked from ships and from the shore. Only 2 of the English ships managed to escape the treacherous onslaught. Drake and Hawkins made their way home separately, ruined and bitter men, but not beaten men. Drake was not only capable of daring action in an emergency, he was equally good at making thorough and detailed plans, and he now bent the whole of his energies to the task of revenge. Early in 1571 he slipped quietly out of Plymouth in a little ship, the Swan, of no more than 25 tons, and without attracting any attention he quietly explored the coast of Darien until he found a hidden cove which would serve as a base for the daring schemes which were maturing in his mind. That his base was in the heart of the enemy's country made it only the more attractive to him. He was planning to strike at the very source of Spanish power, the supplies of gold and silver which they drew from the Peruvian mines. A year later he set out again with 73 adventurous young fellows in 2 ships, the Pasha of 70 tons and the Swan. This time he meant business. Arrived at his secret base, he put together the pinnaces he had carried out in sections. I'm not sure what pinnaces means. I'll look it up later. And in these small boats, easy to manage, easy to fight, and easy to hide, he dodged up and down the Spanish Main for 2 whole years, storming towns, sinking ships, capturing treasure. Fever carried off some of his men, but those who returned brought back such tales of joyous daring that the whole country rang with them, and the myth of Spanish invincibility was broken forever. But Drake was not yet satisfied, and in late 1577 he sailed westward from Plymouth Sound yet again, this time with an even more audacious plan in his head. Since the Spaniards would be fully prepared for him all round the Caribbean Sea, he would sail into the Pacific and surprise them there. The treasure went by sea from the Pacific coast of Peru to Panama, and was then carried overland to the Caribbean port of Nombre de Dios. Officially, Queen Elizabeth frowned on the project. Unofficially, she and many of her ministers took shares in it. Drake was given 4 ships, the Pelican, 100 tons and 18 guns, the Elizabeth, 80 tons and 16 guns, and 2 smaller ships, the Marigold and the Swan. The Pelican was only 63 feet in length at the waterline, and the others were even more ridiculously inadequate to face the storms of the Atlantic and the unknown dangers of the Pacific, but there was no lack of volunteers for the cruise. They reached the Straits of Magellan towards the end of August 1578, but it took them 17 days to make their way through the difficult and winding passage. It was here that the name of the Pelican was changed to the Golden Hind. When they did get through into the Pacific, they were met by a howling westerly gale. The little Marigold went down with all hands. The Elizabeth, with great difficulty, struggled back to the shelter of the straits, and after waiting for 3 weeks and lighting signal fires without response, sailed for home. Drake was driven to the southeast, and so discovered the open sea route around Cape Horn. He took possession of the southernmost island for the Queen, then sailed west and north again, searching for the other 2 boats. Finding no trace of either, he settled down in earnest to carry out by himself the task which he had planned. Every little port on the way up the South American coast was entered and ransacked. These are Spanish towns. Spanish colonial towns, let's say. At Lima he heard great news. A treasure ship had recently sailed for Panama with a year's output from the mines on board. Off they hurried after this prize, and a fortnight later caught up with her. While daylight lasted, Drake towed some empty barrels behind, lest the speed of the Golden Hind should arouse the Spanish captain's suspicions. As night fell, the barrels were hauled aboard, and the quarry was quickly overhauled. A flight of arrows and a few cannonballs spread dismay among the Spaniards, and the boarding party in the boats had an easy task. The Spaniards were shut up in the cabin, while a prize crew sailed their ship out of sight of land. And then, with the wind conveniently falling to a calm, the work of transshipping all the treasure was carried out by the small boats. It took 3 days. When the task was completed, Drake restored the Spanish vessel to her crew and allowed them to go. He now had to solve the problem of finding a way home with all this treasure. First he sailed northwards, hoping to find a northward passage comparable to Magellan's Strait in the south. He was chased by 3 Spanish cruisers, but he sailed calmly on without making any attempt to increase his speed, and this cool contempt quite frightened the Spaniards. They turned back for further reinforcements. Having left the last Spanish settlement far behind, Drake found a safe harbour in Lower California, and there he careened his ship, put in a month's hard work on the hull and rigging. Then he continued his northerly coasting, but the coastline trended west of north, and he soon realized that even if he did find a northerly passage, it would be enormously long, and it was growing bitterly cold, and his men were suffering from the weather after their long stay in the tropics. He could not sail north, he could not return by the Strait of Magellan, for every Spanish warship would be on the lookout, and every port would be guarded to prevent him taking in supplies of food and water. He could leave his ship in the Pacific and make his way overland to capture another ship in the Caribbean, but that would mean leaving behind the bulk of his treasure, and he would not do that. So he made up his mind to follow Magellan's example and encompass the world. He returned to San Francisco Bay and made friends with the Indians, taking in enough food and water for the long crossing of the Pacific. For 2 months they sailed without any sight of land, and then the Pelew Islands brought relief to their weariness. They found a warm welcome in the Moluccas, and a goodly store of cloves and other spices as a useful means of preserving meat. In the Celebes, they had to beach the Golden Hind to scrape her weed-foul hull again. Then the voyage resumed along the north coast of Java, through the most dangerous waters in the world. Drake felt his way with careful soundings whenever it seemed necessary, and in spite of all his precautions they hit a sunken reef and ran hard aground. 3 tons of cloves, 8 big guns, and most of their food was thrown overboard, and a fortunate shift in the wind enabled the lightened ship to hoist sail and back off the rock without too much damage. A pleasant welcome at Batavia made up for this mishap, and soon afterwards the Straits of Sunda offered them the gateway they sought out of the landlocked coral-strewn waters into the open ocean. Home as quickly as possible was now the order of the day. They sailed close to the Cape of Good Hope on June 18th, 1580, finding it a most stately thing and the fairest cape we saw in the whole circumference of the earth. But they did not land, hurrying on until they reached Sierra Leone on July 22nd. Here they found necessary provisions, great store of elephants, oysters upon trees. As soon as sufficient water and food had been taken aboard, they were off again, and reached England on November 3rd, 1580. For 18 months nothing had been heard of Drake, and the politicians of the appeasement party were congratulating themselves on the disappearance of a very awkward customer. Now he was back again, with a king's ransom in his hold, and such a tale of daring and achievement as fired the imagination of every young man in the country. Drake was a national hero. More than that, he had given the British Navy 2 most valuable gifts, a strategy and a tradition. The strategy was that of carrying the war right into the enemy's camp. The tradition was one of audacious confidence. A few years later, when Spanish preparations for the invasion of England could no longer be concealed, Drake took a little squadron of warships right into the enemy's naval base of Cadiz and sank over 10,000 tons of shipping. He would have sunk more if the Spaniards had not shirked a battle whenever they could. This raid delayed the sailing of the Armada for a year, and it gave such confidence to the English seamen that the defeat of the Spaniards was almost certain. They had confidence in their ships, in their guns, and above all in their leaders. The Spaniards still loaded their ships with soldiers and relied on grappling and boarding tactics. The English, with a much better idea of naval warfare, relied on swiftly moving ships armed with hard-hitting guns. When the Armada came, the English hung on its flanks and rear, cutting out a ship here, sinking another there, and worrying them all and giving them no rest. They reached Calais Roads, where they were to take on board the Duke of Parma and his soldiers, as the invasion force. But long before the embarkation could take place, English fireships were drifting down on the galleons, scattering shot and flame among them. In something of a panic, the Spaniards cut their cables and fled northwards, with Drake hammering them as they went. The wind increased to a gale, and their battle-damaged ships were in no condition to stand up to it. They fled ignominiously up the North Sea and round the top of Scotland. Very few indeed weathered the storms and reached Spain again. Drake made England mistress of the seas, and behind the safe rampart of sea power, the country was able to build up its trade, its population, and its strength. Okay, that's story time. Why read such a thing? Well, look, it's jingoistic. It's maybe old-fashioned, but I think that in general, the view of history has gone far too far into the realm of sanitization and frankly oikophobia, where you're where people are always trying to do down their own people or the familiar. I just think it's gone far too far, and the kind of revisionism and the constant self-excoriation for Western participation in something like the slave trade, which was again universally practiced at the time, is having dramatic effects on people. It's really ruining them in their soul, I think. A far more accurate picture of the slave trade is that it was universally practiced. It was a crime against humanity. It was something that hopefully humanity was always on the pathway to abolishing. And the fact is only one power did that. It was the British. And the reason they were able to do that eventually was their domination of the seas. And a person who played a key role in that domination was Francis Drake. That would be a better plaque to put on the statue of Drake. Thanks for listening if you did. Who knows? Someone might enjoy long form content from me like this. See you again for another story time sometime soon. If you did enjoy it, leave a comment. Cheers.